Hello friends, so for today's video I'm going to be doing an if you like this, try that, but specifically with books that were in the Goodreads nominees. So I'm going to start with the Stardust Thief, and the book that I'm going to recommend, and it feels like a very easy recommendation, I'm sure a lot of other people have made the same comparison before, would be City of Brass. Whenever I do these style of videos, I try to be very aware of making sure I don't recommend something just because the setting itself is somewhat similar. Both of these do have a very similar setting, but part of the reason I don't want that to be such a motivation to have it be a comparison is because there's so much more to a story than just the where. So how the characters behave, the kinds of characters that you see, the tone of the story, the writing style, all the tropes that are used, those sorts of things, those to me are a bigger, I think, reason why somebody would gravitate towards one book and then also find another one enjoyable. But in this case, I actually really do think that beyond just having a similar setting, that there are aspects to both of these that people would like. First off, adult fantasy can be a little intimidating to get into sometimes, especially if you are newer to the genre. And both of these, I think, are great ones to jump into if you are typically accustomed to reading young adult or you just haven't read a lot of adult fantasy. I do think the Stardust Thief is a little easier to get into than City of Brass, but both of them have certain aspects to their fantasy world building that we've kind of seen before. The reason the Stardust Thief I think is maybe the better of the two to start with is because it has a 1001 Nights retelling, and 1001 Nights is something I think a lot of people are pretty familiar with. So you're going to see some things in there that you're like, oh, I kind of know this. And then it's really fun to actually get to see that story elaborated on, because I did find that the author incorporated it in a really creative and unique way. But like I said, beyond just the settings being somewhat similar, I also think that they have this sense of adventure to them, this sense of discovery, and almost this going on a quest feeling. And that's something that we seem to be shying away from in the fantasy genre. I think a lot of people were tired of seeing quest fantasy and chosen one styles of fantasy stories. I wouldn't say these have chosen ones necessarily, but they do have that quest feeling. And I think that they are very approachable. I think that the characters themselves are not withheld from you. There's certain fantasy stories where you really feel like you have to earn it to learn about these characters. You really feel like you have to read so much and you have to pick up on little nuances here and there. And these characters, they come to life very quickly. So also, just really quick, if you don't know, I did say this is a 1001 Nights retelling, and then the City of Brass starts out as a historical fiction following a woman who is a con artist, and somewhat similar, not necessarily a con artist, but a woman who is selling certain artifacts, certain items that have some value to them, but also may not be the most legal things to sell. So you do have some parallels between the main characters. But regardless, in City of Brass, this woman, in being a con artist and attempting to do something with a particular item, finds out that magic does exist, and then that's where the fantasy parts come into play and where the world really starts to open up. I'm also really excited because where this one leaves off leaves me to believe we're going to see even more parallels to where we go in City of Brass. After that, we have the book Kaikeyi, and the book that I'll be comparing it to would be The Witch's Heart. I'll put the sleeve, what the cover image actually looks like, up on the screen so you can see beyond just this. But regardless, both of these stories are taking these figures in stories that have been told before in these mythologies, and we're looking at not the main characters necessarily of those stories, and instead we're kind of zeroing in on these people who have either not had much attention given to them or have had attention given to them, but through the lens in which the mythology was created, perhaps the way we viewed those characters was because of the time of the mythology's origin, or the story's origin, or the faith, the belief, whatever it was, the time in which it was created impacted how we see these characters. So now let's revisit these characters and let's look at them again. And both of these have a very mature feeling to them. Both of them are a little bit more slower going and almost slice of life to some degree. And I found that both of them were quite moving and impactful. They are not the adventure stories like the other two I just mentioned. They're not action-packed. The magic is there, but it's not really the focus. It's really zeroing in on both of the women in these stories, Kaikeyi being the woman in this story, and then Angrboda being the one in Witch's Heart. And I would say that with Witch's Heart, you are going to be focusing in a lot on motherhood. This one also has themes of motherhood, but I think this one branches out to some other really important topics. They are very different in their settings, and I do think that the inspiration is quite different, but the story itself, the tone, I think there's a lot to both these that it feels very impactful, or at least it was for me. Next up, of the ones I've mentioned thus far, these two I think are perhaps the least alike, but there is a certain aspect to these that I find to probably be something that if you like one, you might like the other as well. And that would be She Who Became the Sun and Babel by R.F. Kuang. So the reason that I'm recommending these together is because both of them are almost not even fantasy. Both of them very much kind of lean into historical fiction with a few fantasy elements woven in. I would say the fantasy elements are a bigger deal in Babel than they are in She Who Became the Sun. And then I also want to add, beyond both of them having very much an influence from real events in history, and I think both of the authors really doing a lot of research to make sure that the setting was accurate, to make sure as much as possible that the history and the time was presented accurately. I think beyond that, both of these have a literary fiction feel. They're both ones that if they weren't sold in fantasy and I started to see them sold in the fiction section, I'd be like, I kind of get it. I understand, even though there are some fantasy elements. Is it more fantasy or is it just more kind of fiction? Beyond that, we also see very morally gray characters in both of these. We have people who, if you view them from one angle, they're the heroes, they're the good guys. And if you view them from another angle, they are absolutely the villains. I think a lot of people, they don't want their hands held. They don't want people telling them. They don't want the authors inserting, here is the good guy, here is the bad guy. They want to decide for themselves. They want to see how, especially when you're going to have a historical setting and you're really pulling from real events in history, they want to analyze what makes a revolution happen, what makes somebody able to attain power. It's usually not your everyday average person just bumbling around. It's usually going to take something drastic, and they want to see those drastic actions. And I think both of these do not shy away from doing that. Next up, if you read and enjoyed Nettle and Bone, might I suggest checking out the Witcher series. So maybe don't even worry about trying to read all of the Witcher series. Maybe just give the short story collections a try. The reason I'm paralleling these with one another is because Nettle and Bone has a grim fairy tale feel. It feels very adult because some of the things that are hinted at or just told to you are very sad and tragic and heavy and quite dark. And beyond that, these are also, it's really funny. The writing style is very amusing, and so there's almost this sense of it being a little morbid because you're like, when you talk about it, because if you don't know, the setup for Nettle and Bone is that this woman finds out that her sister, who has been married off to this powerful person, a royal individual, she was married off to this person basically to keep their country safe. They need the military that this man can provide. However, he's very abusive to her sister, and so now our main character wants to do what she can to help her sister while also trying to ensure that she doesn't do anything that jeopardizes the safety of their entire country. So it has some really heavy things, and you start to feel kind of bad being like, this book's kind of funny because you wouldn't think it would be. But the writing style itself, the authorial voice that T. Kingfisher has, is genuinely really funny. So you kind of have the heavier, dark things, and then you have the humor, and it balances out, and you get this grim fairy tale feel. And that is, I can't really think of too many other authors that accomplish that as well as Andrzej Sapkowski. I think something that sadly is missing from, the Netflix adaptation, and while there is humor in the video games, I would say even The Wild Hunt doesn't quite hit the humor. It is not as present in either of those adaptations as it is in the original. Sapkowski is quite funny. Sometimes the humor, you really have to, it's almost like you don't notice it for a second because the way it's done is a lot of times in conversations, we'll address something that another character is doing, as an example. and they'll be like, no, stop, exactly, yes. And then they'll be saying stuff, and you never get the narration telling you what the other person is doing, but in a very realistic way, the dialogue is portraying that something else is going on. You kind of pick up on what's going on, and you're like, oh, I see. And I don't know if I'm describing it well at all, but it's kind of snarky, and it's clever. It's very clever, and I think that the intelligence of the characters is present, despite not really being as much in the show, sadly. Anyway, so both of these have the grim fairy tale feelings. If you don't know, a lot of the short stories in The Witcher are basically taking fairy tales, but absolutely not shying away from the darkness of them. When we think of fairy tales nowadays, I think we have this Disney image, and then we add grim to it, and we're like, oh, it's darker. But no, it's the darkness with like a hint of the fairy tale. So both of these, I think, accomplish that tone very well, and both of them, because these are collections of short stories in the first two Witcher books, and then this is just a short book, both of them are able to tell a story in a very short amount of time. Last on the list, and probably the absolute most obvious comparison, would be The Very Secret Society of Irregular Witches. If you liked House in the Cerulean Sea, you should definitely check this one out. So I have said in bringing both of these up before, because they do have really similar setups and they kind of have a similar focus, that I found that with this, it was what I had hoped House in the Cerulean Sea would be. So if you liked House in the Cerulean Sea, I would definitely say give this one a go, because there are a lot of similarities and you might like it. But if you didn't love House in the Cerulean Sea, I would still recommend this one, because they do have kind of different characters, and some of the personal growth that takes place for these characters is different from book to book. But either way, in this story, you follow a young woman who is a witch living among humans, and witches are not known to exist. It's present day. She has to keep this part of herself a secret. And not only that, but witches don't really want to interact with each other all that often, because it increases the chances of them being discovered. So a lot of her life, she has lived alone, and she doesn't really have a place to call home. She doesn't really have that anchor, so she feels quite lonely. And then one day she has an opportunity to teach 3 young orphan witches how to try and control their magic so that they have a chance of being able to live a normal life. And in doing this, she bonds with these little girls. She starts to kind of recognize some of the things in her own life that she wants to, basically, she's teaching them as much as they're teaching her, sort of a situation. And on top of that, there's a really sweet love story, and you do get kind of some things to do with the love interest and his struggles in his life that he's trying to overcome, as well as some really adorable side characters as well. And a lot of that probably sounds kind of similar to what you find in House in the Cerulean Sea, which follows a social worker who is somewhat apathetic. He's sort of burnt out on life. He's not bitter, but he's also not really optimistic either. And then he ends up going to this orphanage to ensure that the children there are being treated properly, that they are being taken care of, and things are a little unconventional there. The children are perhaps not the usual type of children that he encounters, but it's very much a story about love and acceptance, and even if you aren't the, quote, normal type of person, that doesn't mean that you don't have value. So a lot of the themes in both of these are really, really important themes, and they just have a really adorable sugar coating over them, a very strong sweetness to them. And like I said, I definitely think that if you like one, check out the other, but even if you didn't love one, the other one might be more appealing to you, just depending on what you like in characters and plot. That's it for an If You Like This, Try That. Definitely let me know for any of the books I mentioned, what would be some books that you would also recommend. But anyway, thanks so much for watching. I hope you have a lovely rest of your day, and I'll see you all later. Bye.